The Taliban promised to bring peace to Afghanistan, but within weeks, bodies were hanging from cranes. Executions were announced in advance, and crowds were ordered to gather in fields and stadiums. What followed was a system built on public humiliation that left a mark on the entire nation. The Taliban began as a group in 1994 in Kandahar, Afghanistan. Most of its early members were former religious students. This is why they called themselves the Taliban, which means students. Their leader was Mullah Muhammad Omar, a former Mujahideen fighter who had lost an eye during the war against the Soviets in the 1980s. Afghanistan was in chaos at the time. After the Soviet Union pulled out in 1989 and the communist government collapsed in 1992, rival warlords began fighting each other. Cities were destroyed. Roads were blocked by checkpoints. Kidnapping and robbery became common. Many Afghans were tired of the violence. The Taliban promised order and strict Islamic rule. By 1995, they had captured large parts of southern Afghanistan. On September 27, 1996, they took control of Kabul. President Mohammad Najibullah, who had been hiding inside a United Nations compound since 1992, was dragged out, tortured, killed, and his body was hung in public. After taking control, the Taliban officially declared the country the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. Their leadership said they were bringing pure Islamic rule after years of civil war. They shut down cinemas, banned music, and forced strict dress codes. But the harshest changes were in their justice system. They enforced their own interpretation of Sharia law, and they did it fast. There were no long investigations, no appeals, no complex court process. If someone was accused of theft, they could lose a hand. If accused of adultery, they could face death. If convicted of murder, execution was often carried out publicly and quickly. One of the most disturbing symbols of this system was the Ghazi Stadium in Kabul. Before 1996, it was just a sports stadium. Football matches were played there. Families used to gather to watch games. But after the Taliban took power, that same field turned into an execution ground. On Fridays, which is the main prayer day in Islam, people were told to go there after the mosque. It was not optional. Government workers were ordered to attend. Families were expected to come. Even children were present. The stands that once held cheering fans now held silent crowds waiting to see punishment carried out in front of them. The process followed a pattern. The accused would be brought into the stadium, often blindfolded. A Taliban cleric would read out the charges, usually over loudspeakers. There was no detailed explanation of the evidence. The sentence was announced, and then it was carried out on the field itself. Sometimes it was a single gunshot, sometimes multiple shots. In cases of alleged adultery, stoning could be used. One of the most widely reported cases happened in November 1999. A woman named Zarmina was brought into Ghazi Stadium. She had been accused of killing her husband. Reports later suggested she had suffered years of abuse, but that did not change the outcome. She was forced to kneel in the dirt on the football field in front of a large crowd. She was shot in the head. Foreign journalists who later investigated said many in the crowd had been ordered to attend. That execution became one of the clearest examples of how the Taliban mixed religion, punishment, and public fear into one event. These executions were not limited to Kabul. Similar scenes happened in cities like Herat, Kandahar, and Mazar-e Sharif. In some cases, men accused of murder were shot in front of city crowds. In other cases, people accused of adultery were buried up to their waists and stoned. The Taliban also applied a system called qisas, which meant the family of a murder victim could decide the fate of the accused. Sometimes the victim's family was handed a rifle and told to pull the trigger themselves. This turned executions into deeply emotional public events, where grief and revenge were put on display for everyone to see. Human rights organizations working at the time reported that by 2000, there had been dozens of confirmed public executions across Taliban-controlled areas. On top of that, there were hundreds of amputations and public floggings. Thieves lost hands in hospital courtyards. Men accused of drinking alcohol were whipped in public squares. Women accused of moral crimes were beaten in front of crowds. These punishments were often announced in advance on local radio stations so people would know where and when to gather. The Taliban did not try and hide these actions from the world. In fact, they saw public punishment as proof that they were serious about enforcing their laws. They believed fear would prevent crime and keep order. But what it really created was a culture of silence. Neighbors were afraid to speak. Families were scared of accusations. Children grew up watching death used as a warning. After the September 11 attacks in the United States, everything changed. The Taliban faced international pressure to hand over Osama bin Laden, but they refused. Then in October 2001, the United States and its allies launched military operations against them. By November 2001, Kabul fell. By December, the Taliban government had collapsed. Many leaders fled to Pakistan. Others went into hiding in rural Afghanistan. For several years after that, the large public executions that once filled stadiums stopped in areas controlled by the new government. In December 2001, Afghan leaders met in Germany and agreed on a political roadmap that led to an interim administration under Hamid Karzai. By 2004, Afghanistan had adopted a new constitution, and Karzai was elected president. Courts reopened under the new system. International forces led by the United States and NATO spread across major cities. In Kabul, Ghazi Stadium returned to hosting sports instead of executions. For a short time, it looked like that brutal chapter was over. But the Taliban were never fully destroyed. Many of their leaders and fighters crossed into Pakistan after 2001, especially into border areas like Quetta and North Waziristan. Between 2003 and 2004, attacks on Afghan police, government workers, and foreign troops started increasing. Roadside bombs, suicide attacks, and targeted killings became more common. By 2006, the Taliban had rebuilt enough strength to launch a serious insurgency, especially in Helmand and Kandahar provinces, which had always been their strongholds, as well as parts of Uruzgan, Zabul, and other areas in the south and east. NATO forces were fighting heavy battles in places like Sangin and Panjwai. The war had clearly returned. This time, the Taliban did not control big cities like Kabul, so they changed how they enforced their punishments. Instead of stadiums, they used village squares, empty fields, or even dry riverbeds in rural districts under their influence. They set up what they called shadow courts. These were not official courts recognized by the Afghan government, but in many remote villages, they had more power than the state. Local commanders acted as judges. Cases were often decided quickly. People accused of spying for NATO forces, working with the Afghan government, or giving information to police were labeled traitors. In many of these cases, the punishment was execution. Villagers were ordered to gather and watch. The accused were usually brought forward with their hands tied. A short statement was read, accusing them of being informers or collaborators. Then they were shot, often with AK-47 rifles. In some cases, bodies were left in public places as a warning. Fear became a weapon again, just like in the 1990s. But now it was more spread out and harder to track because it was happening in remote areas far from cameras and reporters. Around 2007 and 2008, something new began to appear. Videos of these executions started showing up online. Some were recorded on simple handheld cameras. Others were filmed on early mobile phones. The footage often showed gunmen wearing turbans, standing behind blindfolded prisoners. You could see AK-47 rifles clearly in their hands. After a short statement, shots were fired at close range. These videos were part of the strategy. The Taliban understood that the internet could carry fear beyond one village. A killing in a small district in Helmand could now be watched in Kabul, in Pakistan, or even across the world. By showing that they could identify, judge, and kill alleged spies without hesitation, They tried to break trust between villagers and the Afghan government. If someone even suspected you of talking to NATO forces, your life could be in danger. This created deep suspicion inside communities. People became careful about who they spoke to. Even simple contact with government officials could bring deadly consequences. In cases of alleged adultery or moral crimes, the accused, especially women, rarely had any real chance to defend themselves. There was no proper legal representation. Family pressure, tribal rivalries, or personal grudges could shape the outcome. Once sentenced, the punishment was often carried out in public to send a message. In August 2010, one of the most widely reported incidents happened in Kunduz province in northern Afghanistan. A young couple was accused of running away together without family approval. In conservative rural areas, elopement can be treated as a serious offense, sometimes framed as adultery. The Taliban took control of the situation. The couple was brought before villagers and shot publicly. A video of the execution later spread online, showing armed men firing at close range, while local people watched. The footage shocked many Afghans because it showed that even in the north, far from traditional Taliban strongholds like Kandahar and Helmand, the group had gained enough influence to carry out open killings. 2 years later in 2012, another video surfaced, this time from Parwan province. It showed a woman accused of adultery being executed in a public area. She was shot multiple times while men stood around chanting. The video spread quickly through Afghan media and international news outlets. It caused outrage both inside Afghanistan and abroad. Government officials condemned the killing, and international human rights groups called it a war crime. But for people living in districts under Taliban influence, it was also a warning. Throughout this period, organizations documented hundreds of killings carried out by Taliban forces between 2006 and 2014. Many of the victims were accused of cooperating with foreign troops or the Afghan government. Teachers, tribal elders, construction workers, and even health workers were sometimes labeled as spies. In other cases, disputes over land, marriage, or family honor were brought before Taliban courts and turned into capital crimes. Because these areas were active war zones, exact numbers were difficult to confirm, but the pattern was clear. Public punishment had returned, not in big stadiums, but in scattered villages across the countryside. By the end of 2014, another major shift took place. NATO formally ended its large-scale combat mission in Afghanistan in December 2014, transitioning to a smaller training and advisory role. Afghan national security forces were left to handle most of the fighting on their own. The Taliban used this moment to increase pressure in rural districts. As government forces struggled with funding problems, casualties, and leadership issues, the Taliban steadily expanded their influence in parts of Helmand, Kunduz, Ghazni, and other provinces. With each district that fell under their control, their shadow courts followed, and where their courts went, public punishments often followed as well. The more ground they gained, the more confident they became in enforcing their version of justice openly. In February 2020, the United States signed an agreement with the Taliban in Doha, Qatar. The deal set a timeline for foreign troop withdrawal. Afghan government officials were not directly part of the negotiations. In April 2021, U.S. President Joe Biden announced that American troops would fully withdraw by September 11, 2021. The Taliban began a rapid offensive across the country. By August 15, 2021, Kabul fell without major resistance. President Ashraf Ghani fled the country. The Taliban entered the capital once again. At first, Taliban leaders promised moderation. They said they had changed. But within months, reports of public punishments began to surface. In September of that year, in the western city of Herat, 4 bodies were lifted high above the streets using construction cranes. The men had been accused of kidnapping. Taliban officials claimed they were killed during a rescue operation after a clash with fighters. What shocked people was not only their deaths, but what happened after. The bodies were transported into the city and hung in busy public squares. armed Taliban fighters stood nearby. Crowds gathered below. Some people filmed the scene on their phones. Within hours, the footage was circulating across social media platforms. Herat had once been known as a cultural center, a city of poets and scholars. Now it became the first major sign that the Taliban were willing to bring back the public display tactics they had used in the late 1990s. Fear was once again being used as a public tool. In December 2021, the direction became even clearer. The Taliban announced that public executions and corporal punishment would formally resume under their interpretation of Sharia law. Their supreme leader, Hibatullah Akhundzada, who rarely appears in public but holds ultimate authority within the movement, reportedly approved the reintroduction of hudud punishments, which include executions, amputations, and floggings. This was not just a local commander making a decision. It was coming from the top. The statement signaled that public punishment was no longer an isolated act. It was policy. On December 7, 2022, the first officially confirmed public execution since the Taliban's return took place in Farah province in western Afghanistan. A man convicted of murder was brought to a sports field. Thousands of people gathered. Local residents were informed in advance, and many were told to attend. Senior Taliban officials were present, including judges and provincial authorities. The victim's family was given a choice under the Islamic principle of qisas. They could forgive the killer in exchange for financial compensation, or they could demand execution. They chose execution. A male relative of the victim was handed a rifle. He fired the shots that killed the condemned man in front of the crowd. The Taliban described this as religious justice. Qisas, or retributive justice, is rooted in Islamic legal tradition and allows the victim's family a role in deciding punishment for murder. But the way it was carried out in Farah made something very clear. The execution was staged in a public place with thousands watching and officials standing nearby. It was meant to be seen. It was meant to send a message that the new Taliban government would enforce its laws openly and without hesitation. That event marked a turning point. The public execution system was officially back. And it did not stop there. As 2023 began, reports started coming from several provinces that public punishments were becoming more frequent. In Laghman, Nimroz, and Badghis provinces, witnesses described public executions and floggings carried out in front of large gatherings. Some were held in football stadiums, similar to the late 1990s. Others took place in open fields or city squares. Local officials were often ordered to attend. In some cases, religious scholars and Taliban judges sat in visible positions to show that the punishment had official approval. In June 2023, another execution took place in Laghman province. Once again, the condemned man had been convicted of murder. Thousands attended the event. The setting followed the same pattern as Farah in 2022. Officials were present. The sentence was read aloud. The victim's family was involved. The execution was carried out publicly. The repetition of this format showed that a system was being normalized. At the same time, the Taliban's Ministry for the Propagation of Virtue and the Prevention of Vice expanded its role. This ministry had existed during the first Taliban regime and was known for enforcing strict social codes. After 2021, it was reactivated and given wide authority. Public lashings became more common for crimes such as theft, adultery, and so-called moral offenses. In several provinces, men and women were flogged in front of crowds. Women accused of moral crimes were punished publicly, often in sports grounds or near government buildings. These punishments were meant to demonstrate that social behavior would be tightly controlled under Taliban rule. By 2024, human rights organizations reported dozens of confirmed public floggings and multiple public executions since the Taliban returned to power in August 2021. Exact numbers were difficult to verify because independent media access was heavily restricted, and many foreign journalists were no longer operating freely inside the country. Local reporters faced risks when covering sensitive events. Even so, enough information surfaced through witnesses, local sources, and limited media coverage to show a clear pattern. The psychological impact reached far beyond the person being executed or flogged. When thousands watch a man shot in a field or a woman whipped in public, the message spreads through families, neighborhoods, and entire districts. People adjust their behavior out of fear. They think twice before speaking, before working with certain groups, before challenging authority. Under the first Taliban rule, an entire generation grew up seeing public punishments as normal. Now, a second generation is witnessing similar scenes. The Taliban argue that public justice deters crime, but Afghanistan has faced rising poverty, economic collapse, and international isolation since 2021. More than half the population depends on humanitarian aid, according to the United Nations estimates in 2023. Fear may silence crime temporarily, but it does not fix a broken economy.